So, without further ado, let's get started. So, as I said, we have colleagues from CACI joining us today. We've actually been working with CACI for many years now to access and share their paycheck data. Some of you may be familiar with that, and I know that Stuart will tell you a little bit more about it as well. And we've recently produced a dashboard just to try and help make the messages even more accessible. And if there's time at the end of today's session, then my colleague Sam will jump on and give you a quick demo, but that just depends on whether there is time. And that said, it's not just their paycheck, it's not just the CACI's paycheck data that we're going to be talking about today. They will actually be introducing us to the range of data they hold and how it can be used to help us understand the cost of living crisis, among other things. So if there is interest, there may well be an opportunity for us to explore additional joint procurement of data in the future. So that's it for me. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Stuart and James. And Stuart, it's over to you.
Great. All right, let me find my slides. Can you see that?
We can, yep.
Great, okay, let's
Perfect.
put it on right. Excellent. Let's minimize that. Great. Okay. So thanks, Suzanne, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting CACI to talk about understanding the cost of living crisis with data. My name, as you've heard, is Stuart Eldridge. I head up our communities and government team. And I think before handing over to my colleague James, who will sort of do the main presentation, we wanted to just start with some context and provide you with an overview of the data sets Suzanne mentioned and ones that he'll be talking about, and it effectively gets us all onto the same page. As Suzanne has mentioned again, we will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. And if we do run out of time, we can answer questions offline. And if needed, we can have sort of separate sessions, and whether that's connected with individual use or whether it's to talk about kind of joined up procurement, we can do that. Now, CACI works with a variety of organisations across the public sector, and I thought it would be great to just start with a few examples of where our data has actually been used to support central and local government emergency services and health providers. I won't go through everyone, but if I pick out a couple of them, with the first being City of Westminster. Now, they actually used mobile application data alongside our demographic segmentation acorn, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, to help bring back footfall and business to the city following the pandemic. Now, by identifying the movement and the demographics of people, what they were able to do was actually identify where resources should be improved to encourage behaviour change and get people back into the city, as well as look at how they should be investing with local businesses. Thinking about health, NHS Midlands and Lancashire Commissioning Support Unit have used Acorn and also our health and wellbeing segmentation wellbeing Acorn to understand current health conditions and look at predicting future health and care needs. The aim for them is ongoing, and it's to tailor a better care and support service for individuals, as well as design a joined up and much more sustainable health and care system. And Lancashire Police, they actually use the data to improve their community policing by adapting to changes in the population they serve. They were looking at ways and means to actually better engage within their communities. So CACI provides geodemographic segmentation tools to over 100 local and central government organisations. And what they principally use the data sets to do is an evidence base for decision making. And they're typically used in the following ways: providing the necessary demographic, lifestyle, behavioural and health characteristics helps them to better understand the population they serve and objectively determine the types of services that they're likely to need for future planning services or planning purposes. The datasets also help clearly identify those who are more at risk and vulnerable residents, which in turn allows users to be much more effective at assessing need and demand, which can be used to then inform decision making. And then finally, when you understand the who, the where, and the need, the datasets then will help determine the best way with which you can communicate and engage with residents, as well as how you should prioritise and deliver services and via the appropriate channel. It's also worth noting that many of our public sector clients adopt a blended data approach, making use of not only CACI's data, but use of open and administrative data to actually achieve a much more detailed understanding of their residents and communities to inform decision making. Now, ordinarily at this point, I would probably ask the room, does anybody know what ACON stands for? But as we're all on mute and there's a large group of us, I will share that with you rather than asking that question. So ACON actually stands for a classification of residential neighbourhoods. And what it does is it assumes that people live in similar locations, have similar demographic, lifestyle and behavioural characteristics. So things like income, home ownership, channel preferences and digital behaviours. ACORN is about understanding people's lifestyle choices and behaviours at a postcode level, focusing on the demographics of that very specific postcode. ACORN enables organisations to gain valuable insights on their communities through a range of variables, and these include income and affluence and also financial attitudes. So looking at how well people are off in an area versus those who are facing acute hardship. If you understand age and house type, this could be an indication as to who is older and who tends to have larger houses, how many children that they may have, and who they're likely to actually live with. Digital engagement and social media is very important, particularly as it provides insights about the websites that people visit and the apps that they use, as well as their behaviours and activities online. All things that you would expect to vary from age to age. And this is what ACON actually looks like. It's a hierarchical classification split into categories, groups, and types. As you move across the table, the data becomes much more granular, and every postcode in the UK will sit within one of these segment classifications. Most affluent right at the very top, through to least affluent at the bottom. Most of my clients will use type as an identification for key community groups and key targeting, and it's actually typically used for much more focused targeting than the other levels. There is also a sixth category, which is non-private households, and these individuals are traditionally not marketable to, as they include people that live in care homes, prisons, or who may be in hospital. ACORN combines geography with demographics like age and lifestyle information like affluence. Here's an example of an ACORN persona for affluent type 3, large house luxury. These are provided to give users a quick and easy view of each segment on a page. And the persona highlights key traits and characteristics of the population within them. It allows you to easily see the differences between different postcodes based on characteristics such as internet use, age profile, and income. And these insights allow you to identify where you may need to tailor your services or how you should communicate and engage with people in this type. In contrast, here is ACORN type 34, student flats and halls of residence. Compared to the previous persona, you can see that the age and income profiles have changed, while shopping online and the love to buy new gadgets has increased. And I will share these slides afterwards, so you'll actually be able to sort of flick between the two at your leisure after the session. So Household ACORN has been designed to enhance the advantage of small area segmentation in identifying deprivation by recognising that individual households do not always conform to the dominant or average life stage and family structure across a street or postcode. So for example, if you take my postcode here of wealthy commuters, my neighbour is actually a retired 90-year-old and therefore isn't a rural commuter. So with ACORN, you wouldn't actually know this because that's all about the neighbourhood. Household ACORN, on the other hand, enables you to look at each specific household, and therefore you would be able to actually identify this difference. By understanding the different households within a postcode means you are much better equipped to identify and support those more at risk and vulnerable communities who may otherwise be missed if you solely use postcode or ward or LSOA level aggregations. Like ACORN, Household ACORN classifies each household in the country into categories and types. And the key difference between ACORN at postcode level and Household ACORN is the fact is that ACORN provides neighbourhood characteristics of approximately 15 households, so is ideal for general campaigning such as waste and recycling. However, Household ACORN provides much more detail at a household level based on life stage, and is typically used for more targeted interventions and ideally positioned to support single parent families or the elderly, as an example. Now, the Department of Health and Social Care has always recommended that geodemographic profiling should be used in the health service to identify association between need and utilisation and outcomes for a defined target population. Therefore, CACI has actually developed a completely unique health and wellbeing segmentation called Wellbeing Acorn. The segmentation categorises every postcode in the UK to make it easier to understand the demographic, lifestyle and behavioural characteristics which actually influence the health and wellbeing needs of neighbourhoods. So information through the segmentation provides data on a range of issues such as illnesses, medication, lifestyle risk behaviours, and also social capital. Each type is described in such a way as to give users better understanding of the behaviours and lifestyles and subsequent issues, if any, facing them in the future. And CACI uses Understanding Society to keep this data up to date. Wellbeing Acorn is effectively a reclustering of Acorn that uses a range of health-related variables to distinguish different kinds of health behaviours and potential outcomes as effectively as possible. It allows us to classify the population ranging from the very sick and frail to the most healthy, making targeting strategies for multiple or single health conditions much more effective. Similar to Acorn, Wellbeing Acorn is used to better understand the community and their needs, determine how best to devise interventions and target service, and also paint a unique picture of the health and wellbeing of the UK population. Now, as Suzanne mentioned at the beginning, I'm hoping that many of you will be familiar with our Paycheck dataset. But for those of you who don't, Paycheck is actually a measure of gross household income at postcode level for the UK and is updated annually. Unlike other income datasets, this provides an up-to-date indication of income from all sources, so whether from earnings, benefits, or investments, so effectively providing a view of all income sources. And the data supplied is in the form of 26 income bands, mean, median and mode, and lower quartile. Over 100 central and local government organisations make use of this data, and many of our clients view this as the industry standard. Key applications of use include housing affordability as a big traditional use, evidence of areas of deprivation, and also a tool to actually help with targeting interventions and prioritising the delivery of relevant services. Paycheck Disposable Income takes Paycheck a step further. This data set allows us to calculate people's outgoing in order to be able to live, and this is actually taken directly from government guidance. And in turn, we're actually able to calculate likely disposable income. Although the data set is updated annually, in October we actually conducted an unprecedented mid-year update to reflect increases to our cost of living following the significant changes that took place at the top of government in autumn. The next full update will take place in the spring, and the average disposable income across the UK is currently £18,000. Key applications of Paycheck Disposable Income are predominantly cost of living, principally to identify those who may, due to a range of financial challenges, need the services of the council. And these are people who are traditionally considered the squeezed middle. It's used considerably across the sector due to its flexibility to use of the data to forecast impact at a local level following changes made at a local level from a national level, which I mentioned in the previous slide. It's also used to assess traditional challenges such as housing affordability and better understanding of deprivation. And it's also used to support our cost of living activities alongside Acorn and the survey work that we conduct. And I think it's probably at this point a good moment for me to now introduce my colleague James Debenham, who's going to talk to you about understanding the cost of living crisis with data. So over to you, James.
Great, thank you, Stu. Right, I'll just share my screen. I hope you can all see that okay. Yep. Okay, great. So yes, as Stu says, I'm going to be talking you through how we've been using these data sets, and specifically Acorn and Paycheck Disposable Income, to understand some of the impacts of the cost of living situation that we're in. So what I'm going to talk through to you today is just broadly how we've been using our data to understand that, specifically what are consumers telling us, and then thinking about who and where people are going to be most impacted. And everything I'm going to do is actually using some work that some of your colleagues in Scotland asked us to do, which was just to focus really on child poverty. And I'm going to just show some worked examples of how we were able to use our data to focus very much on areas that might be vulnerable, particularly with regards to child poverty. And so some of the slides sort of relate back to that, but hopefully I'll be able to give a broader view of some of the other applications as well. Okay, so I think it's fair to say we've all been living with this for a long time now. The headlines say it all. Every day we see the constant media round of new new stories and new headlines, be they relating to energy bills or mortgage rates or just how these sort of unprecedented changes that we're seeing are impacting people. But actually, we hear a lot of noise, we hear a lot of news, but what do we actually know? And I think it's fair to say that once we cut that out, we're still learning. I mean, yes, we know that costs are still rising, and we hear various stories every day about where food inflation may be and how that's related, and have we peaked or haven't we? But nevertheless, things are still changing. They're changing on a weekly basis very often. So we have questions of, well, is it getting worse? Have we peaked, or are we now at the new normal? Is this actually, funny enough, one of my colleagues just this morning said, are we, having come through the pandemic and we all thought we were at the new normal, are we at another new normal? But nevertheless, where are we in the scheme of things, and how is it going to impact people? But I think it's clear to say, it's very fair to say we're all aware now that some are going to suffer more than others. And it's about understanding how those different groups are, where they are, and how we target their specific needs for them. It's very much where we at CACI see the power of our data and our approaches. So I think what we're really trying to do is to try to get the truth behind the headlines and try to think about, well, who is really impacted? Where are they going to be impacted? And also just thinking in generally, helping to answer questions about, well, how is that going to impact our organisation? And where should we intervene? Where and how should we intervene? Really, based on that basic understanding of what how can we start to understand what's going to happen next and where the likely impacts are going to be. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of data out there, but there's even more gaps. There's a lot of public information. We see lots of statistics about the consumer price inflation, retail sales index. We know there's information about average weekly earning. We see headlines and reports about credit and debit card spending and various inflation forecasts. So there's lots of public information out there. And then we get lots of public announcements. Different brands or charities or NGOs, whatever it is, giving us news or their opinions on what they think's happening. But there's an awful lot out there, but there's an awful lot of gaps, and those gaps really are the who and the where and the how are these changes impacting us. So what we've been trying to do at CACI is to fill in some of those gaps, and we've got four main inputs into the discussion, and also what we sort of call a monthly voice into what those insights are showing. So the first one is, what are actually people thinking and feeling? So we've been running quarterly surveys on consumer attitudes towards the cost of living. What are people actually thinking about? Now, we started doing this back in March last year, and it's actually very similar to some of the work that we did around the pandemic as we unlocked, which was looking at when we used some of our data to look at customer mobility. Or consumer mobility. So where were people, which consumer groups were moving around more, who was taking longer to come out of that sort of pandemic lockdown. It's the same approach really, but we're doing this with consumer attitudes. So we're doing regular surveys of consumer attitudes, and crucially pulling that back to Acorn to understand how the different consumer groups or population groups are thinking and how they're feeling. But we're also overlaying that with actual real data, some what we call transaction data, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, very briefly. But nevertheless, we can actually see how are people changing their spending habits? How are people adjusting to the changing prices that we're seeing? And then, as Stu said, through disposable income, we can start to say, well, actually, who and where is going to be, who's being impacted and where do they live? So we can get quite detailed on on where we're seeing those impacts. And then through our expenditure forecast, we can start to think about, well, what's going to happen next. And pull all that together, we're pulling together what we call what we describe as a monthly view of the state of the nation, as it were, and that takes the form of a couple of things. The most one being we do a monthly podcast, which I'd urge you to subscribe to. Don't worry, it's not me talking all the time. There's actually other far more engaging presenters, but nevertheless, yeah, there's a monthly podcast which we do, where we talk about various facets across all areas of society, be they mortgages or spending or more vulnerable groups, whatever it may be. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today are two of those things. I'm going to focus mostly on the what do people think and feel, the consumer surveys, and then also the disposable income scenarios. But I will, if you'll indulge me, just talk a little bit about the transaction data, because I think it's fascinating, and it comes back to a point I was making earlier. About some of the noise that we hear and the reports and the anecdotal evidence that we've got about the changes that we're seeing out there. This is a data set that we've got that actually shows us what's happening. And we've just launched recently a product called Brand Dimensions. And it's based on credit and debit card transaction data. Now, we're using this a lot with some of our retail, leisure and more commercially focused clients. So I appreciate it may not have immediate applications here, but I just want to talk about very briefly, because I think it gives some fascinating insights, and particularly it gives some weight and it gives some actual numbers to some of the anecdotes that we're hearing out there about how people are changing their spending habits. We can actually track that. So it's tracked across 300 different brands, and I say it looks at credit and debit card transaction data, so actual real spend. And we can start to see some interesting patterns. Now, one of the things that we've seen very recently, again, if you were to take a brand like Waitrose, now everybody thinks they know an awful lot about Waitrose in terms of who the likely spenders are, and you'd be absolutely right. If you look at the average spend of where those key customer groups are for Waitrose, it's very affluent, of course, as you might expect. Fascinating thing that we saw in this data is that around about the over the Christmas period, we saw a considerable drop from that most affluent group, the Acorn Group Affluent Achievers, within Waitrose. You actually saw people moving away from Waitrose, and a clear trend of even the most affluent consumers starting to trend down. And actually, we saw their spend moving more towards the supermarkets such as Morrison's, Tesco's, Lidl, and Aldi, particularly. So so even the most affluent parts of society, we're seeing the impacts of the current changes that we're all experiencing. And as I say, that group making a marked change to trade down. Another thing was people. There's been a lot of talk about people's sort of leisure activities, the people spending, people eating out more, whatever it may be. What we've seen is that essentially, yes, people are still eating out, but they're going for the more cost-effective brands. So essentially, this graph here, and I'm not dwelling on that too long, but nevertheless, it's a fascinating insight. This graph here looks at essentially how average transaction value has changed against that year-on-year growth, and it's those where the transaction value is lower that we're seeing the higher growth. So essentially, people are looking for sort of better value options. The more expensive ones are the ones that are starting to struggle. And so I think really this is all stuff that we think we know, we've heard anecdotes about, but we have the data to actually show that it's actually happening. And then finally, one that's close to probably all our hearts is just thinking about, if we focus specifically on pubs and bars, we're actually we're seeing a very interesting trend, which is that although the cost of everything's going up, the average transaction value is actually going down. If we round things up, you're seeing the average transaction value in pubs and bars actually dropping, which suggests that actually is this, we were rather glibly suggesting, is this the death of the round? But it's suggesting that people are still socializing, but they're just transacting a little bit less, and maybe not buying a large round for friends at the risk that you might not get bought a drink back, or whatever it may be. And we're particularly seeing that in the student groups. Student life average transaction value is actually down a third. So again, all those sort of impressions that you might have about certain groups and how it affects them, then we can actually see how that's playing through. I'll skip on this now, because I really want to move on to the most important parts of the of this presentation. So Stu showed us how Acorn helps us break the population down into coherent groups based on affluence and life stage. And if we look at here, if we look at a graph here, which is simply age and life stage, you can see how the different groups sort of sit on that chart. And we can really tailor this, or we can look at this metric, across a number of different dimensions. So pulling it back to that example I was talking about in terms of child poverty or child vulnerability, then actually, yeah, we can use the same approach to identify the specific groups by family presence and also income. So if we were to do that, then you can sort of say, right, let's look at the top left-hand corner of this graph. So those with the lower incomes, but more likely to have children. And you can identify 5 clear groups here, which are more likely to have, more likely to be lower income and more likely to have families. So from that practical example of trying to understand where might we target activities towards with child vulnerability, child poverty, then straight away that's a very sort of quick way of doing things. So I'm thinking about, as I say, those elements that we've been looking at. What are people actually telling us? Well, I think so the consumer surveys that we've been running, as I say, we run one a quarter. So we've got another one coming out in the next month or so. We were particularly trying to see how opinions are changing. And of course, absolutely, as I mentioned before, that 24-hour news cycle that we're seeing is absolutely seeing the people increase their concern. It is playing through into people's sentiments. We've seen sort of since March last year, we've seen a 7% rise in overall concern of the cost of living. That's the people are saying, yeah, it's going to affect me. And I'll give you another statistic in a moment, which brings that to life. And we're starting to see more and more people actually worried for more than their family's finances. But also, I think there's a lot of confusion out there, and every time we look at it, that goes up slightly. That people aren't quite sure. They know it's affecting them, but they're not entirely sure how it may be, or rather it's also encompassing that it's sort of a little bit overwhelming. But I think it's fair to say that where we are now, it's absolutely embedded in UK sentiments. That economic uncertainty absolutely is, as we call it, an embedded anxiety. So well over 3/4 of people will say that yes, they are worried about either their own, their families, or their other people's finances, and that's up about 2% since September. In September, it was up about 5% from July. We're seeing roughly the same trend going up in terms of people's sentiments towards this. What I guess I'm getting to is at the moment it's not leveling out. It's increasing every time. We're interested to see at what point do people stop seeing this as an overt issue, and it's just the way life is now, but we're not there yet. It's still happening. And it's interesting when we start to break that out where it's happening. So in these graphs here, and I'll just sort of apologize in advance, there's a death by bar chart in this presentation, so but hopefully it's all giving you the interesting stuff you need. But if we actually look again from the December survey against September in terms of who was more or less likely to say yes, they are concerned about the cost of living, then the interesting thing is that we've actually, whereas in September it was the slightly older populations, sort of 45 and above, it's starting to bleed through into the younger groups as well. So that 35 to 44 and the 45 to 54, 35 to 44, it's starting, that concern is starting to sort of move all the way through the age groups. We break it out by Acorn, that top level category. You can see in September it was the lower affluence groups, the financially stretched. But as we move into December, it's starting to impact the sort of, as Stu described, the squeezed middle. And the fact that those comfortable communities have actually overtaken the financially stretched. The urban adversity, which I guess you could say is the least affluent group in the UK society, it's interesting that actually in September they were less likely to say yes, cost of living is a concern. I mean, in December that has gone above average now. They have peaked. It's intriguing as to whether or not it was because sort of in the comparatively early days of this was a group that sort of felt, well, actually, life's hard anyway, and this is essentially, oh gosh, I hate to use this phrase, it's essentially leveling up, but in the wrong way. That everybody's coming into our world in terms of struggling with the cost of living, but clearly as it goes on and as we've hit winter and fuel and everything like that, that group are now starting to say yes, this it's really is a concern. Whereas perhaps the affluent achievers, you could argue perhaps of sort of were worried about it at the start, but they were waiting to see how it would impact them, and now actually they're sort of thinking, well, maybe we can, we can see through this. But it's interesting how it moves on a month by month basis. If we go into that in a little bit more detail, and we actually start to think about that by acorn group, so drill in a little bit, and it's interesting about what's driving that. So within that affluent achiever group, you can see that it's actually mature money. It's the older ones who are more likely to say that, yes, they're worried for their finances. Whereas actually that pattern doesn't always play through. If you go down a little bit into the comfortable communities, which are the groups in green, you can see that actually they're the similar group there, which is the comfortable seniors, which is the older group. So similar to mature money in age, but perhaps got slightly less affluence, smaller properties, fewer investments, smaller pensions, whatever it may be. Actually, strangely enough, they're the ones who feel okay at the moment. So this is in December. They were suggesting that that things were looking a bit better. But if you look at those acorn groups down the bottom with regards to those groups that we thought were the families, and you can clearly see those modest means and striving families. Yeah, this is very real. It's very apparent for them. And then interesting in that urban adversity that you do see a bit of a split there. That perhaps what we were pulling out earlier about the younger groups, so young hardship, so that very youngest group, not quite seeing the levels of concern yet, but the more family groups, but perhaps they're there. But of course, this is just what people are thinking. How are they actually going to react? Well, what we've been asking about is how are people going to mitigate the cost of living? So what are they thinking of doing? And you can see here how this has changed from June through to December. But despite the onset of winter, I think it's fair to say that sort of back in June and September, it's very easy for us all to say, oh, I'm going to try and use less energy. But then when that first cold snap hit and we all, people sort of thinking, well, actually, the reality is we do. But nevertheless, people are still saying, as we move through winter, that using less energy is absolutely the most common way in which they want to mitigate the cost of living. But then we're also seeing people talking about, as we've seen, switching to cheaper brands and buying smaller luxuries, and those are remaining high. They fluctuate a little bit, quarter by quarter, but they remain really the key things that people are saying that they're wanting to do to mitigate the cost of living. And as I mentioned before, it's fair to say that this has increased the demographic divide somewhat. If we look at our transaction data on year-on-year spend on what we call non-essential goods, then actually, and this goes back a little bit. This goes back to sort of back in the summer. We could see that actually, so even before the cost of living crisis really started to ramp up, so thinking back in sort of summer, you could actually already see that those lower affluence groups were starting to reduce their what we could have called discretionary or non-essential spend, whereas actually the more affluent groups were starting to increase that. So yeah, there's definitely evidence that we can see in the data about that sort of demographic divide, shifting there. But I'll come back to the business of energy. Absolutely seeing it in the data. It's very much the thing that everybody's concerned about. And back in September, nearly 3/4 of consumers were worried about that cost of keeping warm. It was absolutely unprecedented. And you could see, and we could see how actually that sort of level, that relevant level of spend was really starting to change. And again, this goes back a little bit earlier, but actually the key point here is if we look at average gas and electricity bills, yes, it's going up a lot for those affluent achievers groups, as you'd expect from larger properties, but it's still going. Obviously, it's going up relatively higher for the lower income groups, and of course, they're the ones with the less buffer to deal with that. So yeah, so there's definitely some interesting trends that we're seeing in that. And I say that you may notice that does go back to June last year. We haven't been able to update that data yet, but with the new transaction data we've got, we will be able to see how that's played through. So, but if we break that down and look at things regionally and start to see, well, actually that 72%, how does it vary? Well, it's interesting where that pulls through. If you look at it regionally, and I've sort of highlighted Wales here, Wales is about on average about 72%. It's higher in areas like the North East and the East Midlands, Northern Ireland, etc. But yeah, interesting how that varies within that statistic. But then thinking about within that consumer group, about worried about the cost of keeping warm, well, we can see that mature money group that we saw earlier, despite their levels of affluence, that they appear more likely to say that they're concerned. And then within those lower affluent family groups, then really it's those striving families that come through as the highest in terms of, are you more or less likely, but around that 72% average to say yes, cost of keeping warm is a real concern for me. I think it's interesting where in some of these groups where you can almost sort of argue that, well, you sort of say, well, student life, and that could be a small numbers problem. We never quite know with that group. But things like city sophisticates, the sort of urban living, I think that's probably it's almost, you could argue, it's sort of their focus is more on things like rent and mortgages and stuff. And I'll talk about that maybe in a little bit. The other thing we've been spotting with this trend is consumer cost of living, consumer attitudes is, well, how are people going to pay for this? And we can see definite trends about consumers, taking out loans for their day-to-day. There's an awful lot of talk, and we are trying to look further into this. It's actually one of our next main focuses is on savings. Because during the pandemic, we were aware that lots of people were saying that they were saving a bit more because they weren't able to go out and spend. But then the cost of living crisis came along, and for an awful lot of groups, it sort of wiped out their savings. So by September, we were seeing a quarter of people that said they still had pandemic savings at the start of the summer no longer did. So that was by September. Now we're in December, we're seeing that going up as well. And those that taking out loans to pay for bills had increased by a third. Now, when we break that out and see, well, who the percentage of those who expect to use all their savings in the cost of living, and you can see that that really has some stark differences there. The average, say, around about 10%. So Wales, it's nearly twice that. People saying this is going to wipe out my savings, in paying for this. And then again, break that out by Acorn Group, and you can see how stark the difference is for those groups down towards the bottom, which I highlighted, but those were the sort of vulnerable vulnerable families. A real case where if they have savings, they absolutely expect this to reduce those or remove them altogether. And then we started to see actually some of the most extreme examples, which is people saying, well, actually, do they expect to have to turn to food bank usage? And we know, again, anecdotally, we're hearing there's about this, and there's an awful lot of press about this. But back in March, 1 in 20 households suggested that they thought they would need to use a food bank in the next 12 months. By September, that had doubled. It was 1 in 10. That's come down a little bit in December. It came down to about 8%, as it were. But nevertheless, that's a significant number of people who think that they may have to use a food bank in the next 12 months, and it stayed reasonably constant. Again, break that down by region. You can see Wales there above average. So I said that the average now in December was about 8%. So Wales is above average, about 9%. But then when you break that out by Acorn Group, and you can see how that divide that I was talking about is really stark. And this is people who expect to. It's not necessarily those who say that they are. It's just actually saying, yeah, I can see this getting so bad that I'm going to have to turn to food bank use in the next 12 months. So really clear and really vivid, changes there, and sentiments about how this is impacting people. So that's the sentiment piece. I'm conscious of time, so I want to move on to actually how we can start to model and to understand where that's going to have an impact. And this is when we turn to Paycheck, specifically Paycheck Disposable Income. Now, the interesting thing about disposable income is it starts to understand how the cost of living impacts people according to the different areas where their spend are. And so when you look at groups like city sophisticates, as I mentioned before, yes, they may be young and affluent, but they have very high fixed costs of living because of things like rent and commuting, and just general, particularly those living costs. Older groups may have smaller incomes, but actually they've got much lower fixed outgoings. So their disposable income is higher by proportion. And you've got those less affluent younger groups with a low income, and they're already being squeezed because on the cost of living. And why disposable income is so important here is because this is what everybody, it's what you actually realise you have in your pocket at the end, in the month to spend. Once we take out all those fixed costs, and that includes things like tax and national insurance, but say how living, be it mortgages or rents, travel to work, and food as well. Now with food we categorise specifically sort of essential food spend. But what we're able to do with this, once we understand how those different proportions pan out, is we can start to essentially move the dials. So if we recognise that fuel bills are going up or food bills are going up, we can move those accordingly within Paycheck Disposable Income and start to see, well, where does that play out? And so over the course of the last few months, we've been running various scenarios as we've seen energy price caps coming in and out, food inflation going up, whatever it may be. We can start to move those dials and see where those which groups are more likely to be hit. The latest scenario we've run, just if you think about with food inflation running at 17% at the moment, interest rates biting some households, not all, only about 25% or so, whatever it may be, but nevertheless, the change in interest rates will have an impact on some. You can see how, well, overall we're forecasting a 10% drop in disposable income for all households. You can see how that varies by grouping. One of the ones that stands out here, as I mentioned before, that City Sophisticates group, who, despite the name, sound like they've got higher incomes, but once you start to take out those costs, those fixed costs, their disposable income starts to get impacted quite heavily. But then it's down here in the less affluent groups that you can really see some of these stark changes with way over, in some cases, over double that impact that we're seeing. And of course, it's not just food. There's other things as well. And it was particularly we were able to start to look at this from the point of view of energy costs. So we did a lot of work back in October when the various price rises and price caps were being discussed, and we could really clearly see how the likely changes were going to impact the different household groups. So what you're looking at here is essentially that this is the sort of forecast impact on disposable income by Acorn Group. And the more red that you see, obviously the greater proportion of people are going to have the higher impacts on their disposable income. So this is what we were able to do back in October. We could say, well, the October price rise is expected, but then they were saying, well, if bills go up to £6,000 in January, as you may remember back then, that was what was being expected. You could see how stark those impacts were going to be, and you could really see why the government had to act. And actually, if you looked at where those impacts were going to be before that energy cap, and then when they brought it in, you could really see how that sort of mitigated. I'm not saying it fixed by any stretch of the imagination, but it mitigated some of those proposed really quite sincere and enduring changes. So that that was something that we were able to do and able to actually see, understand where those forecasts, where those impacts might be happening. But I think it's fair to say, obviously the energy price cap has clearly helped, but energy is not the only cost. The other thing, of course, with this is it does allow us, with our scenarios, to start to play around with those inputs. And of course, one of the things that we're all very conscious of is salaries and that income. Now, it's an annual. It's an annual product we update. Well, actually, sorry, we've done a mid-year update, but nevertheless, there's a fixed point. And so, what we're trying to do here is trying to get the right balance. Now, the scenario that we've got at the moment, because we updated sort of mid-year, we haven't put any more increase in income into that. So this is really trying to replicate what people are going to be sort of thinking and feeling as the bills come through and land on the mat, because actually salary increases sort of happen for those for those who are fortunate to get them. They happen maybe once a year, as it were. So actually, if we take that out and actually say, well, actually this is what people are thinking are happening, because they're seeing the prices going up, but then they're maybe a long way off any sort of wage increase. So if we take that approach and play it out, then we can start to sort of understand where. So taking Wales as an example, we can actually say, well, what where are those proportional impacts going to hit? So using that latest scenario, and playing it out. Then you play it across Wales, but these are just the local authority districts. Then you can see that there are some real differences even across Wales in terms of where you're going to see that highest impact. So this is the proportion of households with a greater than 10% drop in their disposable income. So if you think the average drop is around about £1,500 or so, we've got to be really careful about averages, as we've seen, because that really varies by Acorn Group. But nevertheless, it's not just the urban areas that are always taking the biggest hit. There are others as well, but it's clear that those impacts are countrywide. But to pull it back to that sort of worked example, if we start to drill in, so areas like Merthyr, where we're seeing some of the very highest impacts, we can start to drill into that. So using Paycheck Disposable Income, what I've done is I've mapped that out by output area here, and I focus in onto Merthyr. And this is again the same, the proportion of households with a greater than 10% drop in disposable income. We can use this data to isolate specific areas. So if we start to strip out those with the very highest impacts, you can start to see whereabouts in Merthyr and whereabouts in the area you're going to, which neighbourhoods you're going to see those really biggest impacts. And then if you overlay that, so what we call taking a blended data approach, with the proportion of households that are more likely to have dependent children, then straight away you can start to see whereabouts in the area you might want to target those specific measures or whatever it may be. And if you start to roll that out, then as I did, use the same way of drilling in, then that gave us roughly about sort of 655 output areas across Wales, where there was the highest impacts of the cost of living, and where dependent children was around about 1.5 times the national average. So more likely to find them. You've got 655 output areas covering about 83,500 households. So a large number of people, but the fact is obviously we can identify where and who, and through things like Acorn you can start to understand what are their sentiments going to be, and what are the areas you most likely need to focus on. So I think in terms of just to summarise, I'm conscious of time because I know we've got time for questions, and I think really I'll flip through the animation. But in terms of what you can do, I think the thing to do really is to focus on reliable public sources. There is some good data out there, but it's making sure that it's reliable and it's appropriate to what you're trying to do. It's quite clear, as we've shown from using things like Acorn and Paycheck, it's about understanding the very sort of targeted local area data about specifically where in your areas you're going to see the highest impacts. And then through things like we can see how we can use scenario tools to start to move the numbers around, to start to say, well, what do we think might be happening next. And clearly with that blended data approach I'm talking about, you can start to use that for more sort of predictive modeling, to start to say, well, actually, specifically where, and by how much will we see change, how do we track that and move it accordingly. And then of course, please feel free to follow our monthly tracker and subscribe. We can send the links around for those of you who might be interested in some of the wider things that we're talking about, and what we have to say. So as I say, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to stop there. I hope we've got enough time for questions. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I almost forgot to come back in then, because I was sat just listening and paying attention. So thank you very much both. We've got one comment in the chat at the moment, just to say that it's absolutely fascinating, the information, and it seems like those with money care more about losing it, which is probably something that is quite accurate. We have no questions yet, but if anybody does have questions, then please feel free to put one to submit them now. Sorry, I've got one. I'm not sure. Again, this quite often happens that I'm not quite sure how I want to phrase the question that I'm going to ask, so I'm probably going to ask it quite badly, but I'm sure you'll understand where I'm coming from. I think it was when Stuart you were talking and kind of describing, that a lot of the data, or some of the data at least, is actually at household level, and that you can kind of identify and categorize people at a household level. And whilst as somebody who's interested in data, that's really useful, as then also a householder, I'm like, oh heck, how does that kind of like apply to me? So I just wondered, what were the GDPR implications, if there are any, around this, and kind of how do you get around that? Well, not around that, how do you answer that?
That's a good question. So I know that what we did was, when we were creating all of the household level data, we had to, as part of our GDPR obligations, we actually had to go through a process of doing data impact assessments to ensure that what we were actually using actually were in keeping with GDPR legislation. And I know that there is public interest and legitimate interest in some of the data. We did make some changes to some of our data because of GDPR compliance. But in order for us to actually kind of do what we've done, we've gone through all the necessary checks and balances in order to actually kind of do that. And we can perhaps actually share our technical guides. So our technical guides actually kind of provide more insights about kind of what our method is, what our approach is, and the data sources actually use, and as well as all that kind of GDPR element of stuff. So we're happy to share that kind of afterwards.
Thank you very much. We have a question. Where can I access the CACI tracker? Is it on the website?
Yes. I'm just looking for the link. I'm just going to post the link now.
Shall I leave that to you, James?
Yeah, I've got. Yeah, well, yes. There we are. Yeah, so posted the link there.
There we go.
Thank you. Another question. Thank you for that, James. Have you done any specific work looking at in-work poverty?
I haven't personally. I've had conversations with authorities where this has been something that they have actually wanted to actually look at using our data to support that kind of thing. I think what we are starting to see much more is people less reliant on taking the data only and actually wanting the kind of insights that kind of come out at the end. So we are doing more project work and kind of supporting authorities to kind of work through these examples. But this is one where I know the data has been purchased or licensed in order to actually do, but we've not been specifically involved with that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
I think there's actually two questions that look very similar about our data sources.
Yes.
So like I said, I think the best thing for me to do, given the time we've got left, is I'll share with you, Suzanne, the technical guides for the Acorn data and the Paycheck data, and then you can kind of circulate those to everybody who's on the call, because what that does is it outlines what the approach is, the methodology, and the data sources that we use. So it should answer those questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we were concerned that we wouldn't have time for a demo of a dashboard because I thought that, you know, with the questions that are coming in, but so far that is another one. No, that's just reiterating what's been said before, so thank you for that. So if it's useful, I mean, obviously what I will say is that even if the questions are still coming in, we should have access to them afterwards. And so even if we can't get round to answering everything that comes through, then you should still be able to access the chat. Everybody should still be able to access the chat afterwards, and so maybe we can do some replies in there. There is another one that's come through. What are you using to model the data? Will that be covered in the guides?
It will.
Well?
I know that what people may be more interested to know is what's actually coming, because actually Acorn is due to be updated as part of our sort of regular cycle every 10 years around the sort of time the census happens, and certainly we will be using sort of deep learning techniques and AI, machine learning, as part of the way that we are looking at kind of coming up with the segmentation. That's not yet out, but certainly the current version within the technical guide that should answer the question about what we're using to model the data, because it actually kind of goes into more detail about the approach and methodology.
Fantastic. Excellent, thank you very much. So what we're going to do, we don't now have time to do a demo of a dashboard, I don't think, but what Sam and I have agreed is that obviously we've told those of you who are on the call that dashboard exists. It is only available to local authorities, because we've worked with CACI to purchase the data on behalf of the local authorities. So if you are interested in learning more about that, please get in touch with either myself or Sam. You ought to have the email addresses, but we can put them in the chat now. The other thing to note, though, is if you aren't a local authority and are interested in it, then, you know, either get in touch with us, or obviously you can get directly in touch with Stuart and James. And the other thing to mention is that, obviously, as I've mentioned before, we only currently purchase the Paycheck data. So if there is interest from anyone on a call, particularly from a local authority, around maybe looking to purchase some of the other data, then what I would say is get in touch with us, please, because we can start to have those conversations. We will have those conversations anyway, but if you're particularly interested right now, then please get in touch with Sam and I. Sam has put Now here we go. Corrected my email address on in the chat. So our email address is there. So if you are interested, then please drop us a line. And we're really excited. I mean, I sat there and listened and thought some of this is just so fascinating that I just wanted to get my hands on it. So I think we'll probably definitely be in touch again.
And actually, just to add is that we've just released the 8th podcast, which I think is that in the link that you sent over, James. I think it is in the the link.
The podcasts are in there.
Yeah. So and that's just with the latest sort of available data, and I know that there will be another one coming next month as well. So if people go in and register for that, and they've got time to kind of listen to the 20-30 minute podcast, it's a very interesting listen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both. That's bang on. We've done brilliantly for time. So it just remains for me to say thank you ever so much, and to wish all of those of you who have attended a good day, and hopefully you found that really useful. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you for inviting us. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
bye for now.
Thanks.
See you later. Bye.